we are an interdisciplinary research centre that was established in 2022. We're based in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. And we were funded in response to a call from the Kavli Foundation, which is a major funder of neuroscience, nanoscience, astrophysics research, partly in response to the kind of question about, or questions about the ways in which novel scientific advance was raising new questions about the ethical implications of that science and the kind of social and its social consequences. And so our remit really is to experiment with different ways of bringing scientists and the public together, to think about what some of these ethical challenges associated with discovery science are, how we might get better at anticipating them in the future, and how we might act on them. And our particular interest is in genomics, because reflecting our kind of history at Sanger, but also in AI and data science. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of work that we've been involved in over the last year or so around AI. And as you'll see, so we have a kind of emphasis on trying to use creative approaches to our work, drawing on a range of social science methods particularly. So I'm a sociologist by background. And we have two aims within the centre, or two kind of domains of aims. One is focused on, I suppose, the wider public context of science. So we really want to help build public awareness of some of the futures that are associated with science and its ethical implications. And we also want to try and build public confidence and capacity to engage with these ethical implications in conversation. And that relates to our kind of second domain of goals, which, rather than focusing on the public, is about working with scientists, researchers, developers, to try and build capacity and opportunity there to think about these kind of questions of ethics and society, not as something that only occurs at the point at which a researcher has to go through an ethics review process, or in their kind of NeurIPS form, or something like that, but just as kind of a routinized, normal and mundane part of everyday scientific practice. The work that we all do presents us with questions that we may not as necessarily recognize always as ethical, but which may have an ethical dimension to them. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. But the context for what I'm going to talk about in the next half hour is really a kind of reflection on a move, particularly in the last couple of years, to a kind of a growing number of efforts to bring the wider public, defined in various different ways, into conversations and discussions about AI governance, AI development, regulation, and decision making. And to kind of, so what I'm really interested in is how these conversations about the public relate to questions of responsible AI, and particularly to questions of trustworthy AI, because from my perspective as a sociologist, I've long been interested in questions of trust, and I'm interested in understanding what that relationship is between AI systems and the public that requires a trust relationship, and if we do need trust, like how might trustworthy AI be more worthy of trust, public trust? I'm going to do that in 4 stages. So the first is just to set a bit of background about how trust has become seen as something that those of us involved in developing, regulating, talking about AI, how trust has become an issue. And then to think a little bit about what we know about public trust in AI systems, and then to move to thinking about, well, given what we know, putting what we know about public trust to one side for a moment, actually, what is it that we mean when we're talking about trust, and in what ways can involving the public in these conversations be useful? Which is where I'm going to introduce this kind of idea of responsiveness, and then think about, towards the end, some of the ways in which we as a centre and others have worked towards what might be considered responsive AI, or responsive and responsible AI. Yeah. So just to give a bit of background, so what you've seen in a kind of range of policy pieces, particularly, but also in the ways that that researchers in academia, industry are talking about AI, is about the importance of public trust. So the top one here is from the top quote here is from the OECD from 2019, talking about how trust is a key enabler of digital transformations. That in order for the diffusion and adoption of AI to occur, we need AI systems to be trustworthy, and that as part of this, we need a whole of society public debate. The EU white paper on AI in 2020 similarly talked about how a lack of trust was a major factor, was one of the main factors holding back the broader uptake of AI. And so it's just a couple of examples amongst a panoply of concerns about trust, related both to AI systems, but also related to the data that underpins models. So this is from the House of Lords also in 2019, I think, in the end, but which talks about maintaining public trust. Maintaining public trust over the safe and secure use of data is paramount to the successful widespread deployment of AI, and then talking about the example of personal health data as being a particular topic of concern, and that's obviously something that and that is something that we've been particularly interested in. And alongside this kind of this discourse around the importance of public trust in AI systems and in data use, we have the emergence of guidance on trustworthy AI. So this one, which I'm sure many of you come across before, is from the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence of the European Commission, which set out its ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and talking about the need for trust to kind of go above, for AI systems to be worthy of trust, to need to go above and beyond being legally compliant, ethically adherent, and robust, but for the need for a whole system approach here, such that trust can be ascribed to all people and processes involved in the AI system's life cycle. And those guidelines propose a range of technical approaches to ensuring robustness and safety. They include things like transparency and governance, oversight, and so they end up putting together this kind of social and technical framing for trustworthiness, including a range of non-technical methods for securing trustworthy AI. And I'm not going to go through these, but what I wanted to flag was this question of stakeholder participation and social dialogue, and use that as the kind of jumping off point to think about this relationship between the public and social dialogue and trustworthiness of AI. So there are lots of reasons that have been kind of well articulated for more than 20 years why you might want to have kind of social dialogue around new science and technology, not least because decisions that affect everybody in every part of everyday life should involve some level of representation from those people. But that's not necessarily the same as arguing that this is part of trustworthiness. So in kind of trying to understand this a bit more, what I'm trying to do is answer this kind of question that as everybody is talking about trust, as trust is folded into definitions of technical trustworthiness, of social trustworthiness, the charge that that Reinhardt makes in a paper from a couple of years ago now is that essentially trustworthiness has become meaningless, that we've overloaded the notion of trust and we've just turned it into an umbrella term for an inclusive list of things that we think are good. And so from a kind of public perspective, my question is, can we make trustworthiness and trust meaningful again? What would it take to do that? So I'm going to move in 3 stages through the rest of the talk. So I'm going to ask the kind of question of, like, is actually, when we look at what we do know about public trust, is trust an issue? So what do we know about public trust and whether it matters? And then think about what do we even mean by trust. And then if we do think trust is important and we can say something about what it means, then how might social dialogue, as recommended in the high-level expert groups recommendations, how might social dialogue contribute to better trusting? And so a lot of what we know about public trust in AI comes from a series of large surveys, and I'm not going to review those comprehensively. But perhaps kind of the biggest recent one is this study that was conducted by University of Queensland and KPMG that looked at trust in organizations who are responsible for developing and implementing AI across 17 different countries. And I'm going to bracket out for a moment the question of, when we're talking about the public, are we talking about trust in an AI system itself? Or are we talking about trust in those who are responsible for developing, implementing, regulating it? Because partly because I think that often once you move outside a kind of technical domain, that distinction becomes relatively unhelpful. But what this study from KPMG in Queensland discovered was that essentially, when people are more confident in those people who are developing and governing AI, they are more likely to trust in AI systems. And that level of trust shelves off between those who have high or complete confidence or trust in universities and research institutions, the lower number who have confidence in technology companies, and the lower number than that have trust in national governments. And this is a kind of consistent finding across the countries involved. And that reflects work that we did a year or two before that about data, about trust in data collection and use. So this was a study in which we talked to 37,000 people across 22 different countries about the use, the collection and sharing of genomic data, specifically genomic and health data, in terms of who would people trust with that data, and finding again this kind of pattern of trust in people's own doctors, trust in universities and research institutions, trust in companies less, and also finding that once you started to move outside a country, then trust again dropped even more. That pattern broadly held across countries, although the exact differences did vary, and that trust was played a significant role in whether or not members of the public in these 22 countries who responded to our survey said that they would be willing or not willing to share their data. So compared to those who basically said that they would trust their doctor with their data and nobody else, of whom 34 out of 100 said that they'd be willing to donate. For people who trusted their doctor and a researcher, or a doctor at a company, 66 out of 100 people said that they would be willing to donate. And those two snapshots from the KPMG study and our Your DNA, Your Say study kind of give an indication that actually, practically, this question of public trust does seem to matter for the legitimacy and the viability of kind of data-driven systems. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question of like what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about trust. So when we ask people what are they trusting, what kind of relationship are we measuring? Are we just measuring whether or not something is good? So, which is why I moved from the kind of quantitative into more of the conceptual, because trust and trustworthiness have been major issues, major questions of focus for over the last kind of 40 years in both sociology and philosophy. Partly because it's long been held that trust is a really essential feature of social and economic interaction. You need to know, you need to have some basis for dealing with people, and particularly as societies have become more complex, the importance of trust in those interactions has become correspondingly more important. And on the basis of, and trust in those complex societies functions as a means of dealing with uncertainty, where you can't guarantee or predict how somebody's going to behave, or whether they're going to do what you expect them to do. It's generally considered to be this three-part relationship. So A trusts B to do something. They don't necessarily just trust B universally. So this might be, I trust my doctor to deliver care, but I may not trust my doctor to do my plumbing. So trust is domain specific. And importantly, and I think this is a kind of parallel conversation that I'm not going to get too much into, but trust differs from questions of reliance. So where reliance is a much more mechanical process, in a sense, where you can, if you have reasonable expectations of how somebody's going to behave, if they've shown that they can do it before, if you have kind of transparency and accountability in that relationship, you essentially don't need to trust, because you know how it's going to work out. If it doesn't work out, you don't feel betrayed or emotional. You just feel that there's been a failure somewhere in accountability or in the governance process, but it's not necessarily down to the quality of the relationship between you and the person you're trusting. And actually, I think there's quite a kind of strong argument that that's what we're actually looking for when we're talking about trustworthy AI, and that trust is a red herring in some of these circumstances. But sticking with trust, because it is at the heart of all of these documents, one of the important things about trust is that it's risky. It involves some element of vulnerability. You trust when you need to, and you have to depend on the person that you are trusting or the institution that you're trusting. And as a result, you need to have some indication that they're trustworthy. Either that's because they've promised you something, they've made a commitment to you, or because you think they've got your they have goodwill towards you, or because you think you share the same kinds of goals. And if we can make a good assessment of the trustworthiness of the person or institution in which we're placing trust, then that means the trust is well placed. And that's really the goal of a trust system. We want trust to be well placed in situations in which trust is appropriate. And as I mentioned, there are various accounts that are given of how we know if somebody's trustworthy. That could be because of their commitments, because of their goodwill, because of the of shared interests. But one argument that's made is that trustworthiness involves being appropriately responsive to do what you are being depended on to do. So that if somebody is counting on you to do something, you are appropriately responsive to that. And that means that in order to be trustworthy, you have to know what it is that you're being counted on to do. So this is described here in this quote here from Karen Jones. In order to recognize that we're being counted on, therefore, in order to be trustworthy in this responsive sense, that means we have to do some work to find out, in the words of Nancy Potter, to have a clear vision of what it is that people are trusting us to do, what it is that we're able to offer them, and what are the things around us that may enable us or stop us being trustworthy in this way. So it's not just about whether an individual is capable of placing trust wisely. It's not just about whether an institution or an individual has the qualities of being trustworthy, but it's also about the interaction between them. And so what we're trying to do here is to establish better acts of trusting. And so that kind of loops me around through to this kind of question of responsive AI. And this is so, and of understanding some of this motive for societal dialogue, such that when Angela McLean, who's the UK government's chief scientific advisor, spoke at the AI Safety Summit, we can understand how this question of, this desire to hear from the public, not just to consult with them, but actually to hear what they have to say, we can understand how that fits into an idea about trustworthiness. And particularly how it relates to societal dialogue. So this idea that what we need is for trustor and trustee, so the person who is trusting and the person who is potentially trusted, to work together to establish the terms on which that relationship is going to work. And that dialogue and deliberation, the dialogue as a kind of case of opening up of the questions that are involved in the conversation, and deliberation as a kind of then bringing that down to decisions. Dialogue and deliberation are key parts of this process of establishing the kind of terms of engagement. But that might be quite abstract. And so what I want to do is just show a couple of examples of how we've been trying to, in our work at the Kavli Centre, bring together scientists and the public to establish these kind of shared terms of engagement, such that both trustor and trustee have an opportunity for understanding how they can count on the other party and when they are being counted on. So the first is called the Hopes and Fears Lab. So this is really about building opportunities for conversation, building spaces that enable people to come together in ways that are non-threatening, low risk, and that hopefully through kind of repeated engagements, both members of the public and the researchers involved in them can have an opportunity to try out, play with, practice that kind of process of listening, reflection, and an equal contribution that's necessary for this responsiveness. So this is something that we held in November last year, and they were these small-scale conversations between AI researchers and members of the general public around their hopes and fears on AI. And what it looked like in practice was this. We, in a moment that I had never expected to arrive in my career, we managed to wrangle 2 double-decker London buses onto a park in the middle of Cambridge. We had 32 researchers over the course of 3 days who joined us on the buses to take part in these open-ended conversations, sit down with passing members of the public, and we had about 200 people 200 members of the public who dropped in over the course of the days to have conversations about AI. We also moved our setup to London, where we held an event as part of the AI Fringe alongside the government's AI Safety Summit last year. As you see, the entire the structure of the Hopes and Fears lab was designed by an artist called Tom McLean, who's the kind of tall guy on the right there. But the aim was to try and establish this architecture or infrastructure in which you can have these conversations in a way that is non-threatening, open, and fosters listening. And so in this case, it involved playing with some of the elements of the lab. So cardboard desks, cardboard everything, essentially. But in a way that just kind of created a playful context. We asked people at the end how their views had changed, and what kinds of. So we captured some of the things that they talked about during their conversations about the need for AI to empower us, kind of questions of ownership, questions about empathy as well, the things that kind of came up quite prominently. We saw a general movement through the conversations from people being kind of unsure about AI or fearful, generally kind of moving towards feeling more hopeful, but also some who'd sat down, had a conversation with a researcher and came out feeling more worried about the world. But generally, what we were most interested in was about this capacity, about kind of trying to foster this societal capacity for dialogue. And we found that both researchers and members of the public felt that they would increase their ability to do this. And this was something. So there's a video on our website if you want to have a look into that more. There's a lot of pictures of buses. This was something that we took into another project we did also alongside the AI Safety Summit, which was led by Connected by Data, and we were partners on this project alongside the Accelerate Programme for Scientific Discovery at the university, the Mozilla Foundation, Ada Lovelace, Sortition. And this was an attempt to bring a public voice directly into the conversations about AI safety that were happening at Bletchley Park in November last year, but which had very little no opportunity for wider social engagement. And so this was a deliberative forum that we ran over 3.5 days, in which members of the public who were selected from across the UK by a process called sortition, so attempting to kind of get a representative group of 12 members of the public to engage with researchers, to engage with some of the sessions that were happening at Bletchley, to spend more time in kind of detail on thinking through some of the consequences of AI, and to then come to a kind of set of recommendations. So, as one of the members of the panel described, it was to ask the questions that the techie people won't think about. How will AI affect factory workers and teachers? Because there aren't many of them involved in the AI summit. We'll ask the questions that are less specific, which are of more concern to the whole population, rather than to the tiny bubble of tech people who might want to have something to say. So it's clearly about trying to establish this relationship in which the technology becomes responsive to these kind of wider societal concerns. I'm running short on time, but I just want to say they produced seven recommendations, again, including kind of developing systems of governance that were international, that were responsive to citizen concerns, that were inclusive, about the importance of raising awareness, and about continuing to have a national conversation. There's a QR code there if you want to go to more information about it, and there's an event at the AI UK Fringe on Thursday, at which a number of us will be talking about how the panel worked, including some members of the panel. And they established they set out some values that they felt that AI should adhere to. But In the interest of time, I'm going to move on, because I think there's so alongside those projects that we've been involved in, there has been these kind of growing efforts from companies like Meta, working with the Stanford Deliberative Polling Group, from OpenAI and their experiments in kind of bringing the public into governance. These very efforts at scaling up what can be really small, intensive processes with 12 members of the public into something that can exist at a level of thousands of people. And I think there's really, really exciting and kind of interesting things going on there. I think there's also in those approaches and in the ones that I described, a number of outstanding challenges. So, and this kind of key question of like, how are we enabling these two-way interactions that we're trying to build? How do we enable them to establish the terms of what are we being trusted to do, and are we able to take on that trust? How are we clear about who we are responding to, and who is it that's shaping the questions that are being asked in these? And then just on that final point there, there's an issue about when groups like the People's Panel on AI or the Hopes and Fears members of the public say that they would like to trust developers, researchers, or companies where they want to be able to count on them to do particular things. How do we enable a system that doesn't just create that as a kind of one-way public direction of research, but that allows a kind of feedback loop to be created in which developers and researchers are able to respond to and shape those expectations, such that they're both more feasible and also maybe more considered. Okay, so in sum, what I've tried to do in half an hour is argue that there is a place, I think, for a conversation about trust, that trustworthy AI doesn't necessarily just have to be a list of things that we think are good in terms of the kind of wider social and ethical conversations about AI. But it requires us to engage a bit with what we think it might mean to be trustworthy, and how that differs from just a kind of relationship of reliance. I think that one opportunity for thinking about what it would mean for AI to be trustworthy in this sense is to understand or to establish, to build a responsive system, and that these kind of questions and that these proposed mechanisms for social dialogue and approaches to social dialogue can become a means for defining and articulating and communicating when we are counting on somebody and when we're trusting them, and that building these dialogues requires quite a lot of work. It requires attention to building capacity on both sides and the kind of creation of an architecture for dialogue. But we are moving along, although there's things left.